wanting to learn about the Native Americans that lived in this area. You heard about my background, so I don't have to go into that. Enough about me. I've done my homework and my research, but I'm going to have to refer to my notes. Please be patient with me. Now, the beginning of history, once upon a time, and this is not a fairy tale because it does not end up as a fairy tale. Around the 16th century, the Europeans arrived in this country and in Florida. They found it inhabited by tens of thousands of Native Americans. They had a very complex economic, social, and political structure. They had developed governing, religious, and warrior classes. They executed large construction sites, which required large numbers of workers, and did it very successfully. Their villages and campsites lined the rivers and streams and bays and lagoons of the whole state of Florida. There were 6 major groups that lived here with many subgroups. All are now extinct. 4 very important words. Why? What happened to them? From the first voyagers that came across the ocean, we refer to them in the museum trade as the white man or the Europeans. Disease came with measles, smallpox, whooping cough, things today that are gone for us as far as a death threat. But they had no immunity to these things. They never had these diseases. 90% of a tribe of people could be wiped out when an epidemic started. So disease, very, very important reason. Also, the whites used the Indians as slaves to work plantations and their farms and whatever they were putting up at the time, even just building missionaries and things. This was very hard on the Indians. They weren't allowed to do the things that they normally were used to doing and couldn't feed themselves. They had to depend then on the white man. And also the position of the church that came with the explorers and the armies had a very hard influence on the Indians. By the 17th century, there were no Indians left in Florida. A few escapees, yes. A few hiding somewhere, yes. This put the white man in a dilemma. He had no one to work his ranches or his plantations. He was without a workforce. So they sent some missionaries and runners up north to Georgia and the Carolinas and contacted a tribe of Indians called Lower Creek Indians. And they talked to them about coming down to Florida. They promised them the moon. And those that did come down were turned into slaves to work for the white man. After a while, they rebelled, of course, fought with the whites, and then escaped into the Everglades. Around 1775, a new tribe of Indians emerged from this, and we call them the Seminole today. The Seminole were not here before then. The Seminole actually were Creek Indians in the beginning that came down and assimilated with the Indians in the Everglades. There are about 2,000 Seminole living in Florida today, which isn't too bad. When you compare it with a tribe like the Navajo, you're speaking small numbers. But it's kind of an average of tribes across the whole country. Now in this area we had two tribes of Indians that populated in this area. The Tippecanoe, who were also called the Timmies, and it's a little easier to remember, so I'll refer to them as the Timmies. And the Calusa. The Timmies occupied Tampa down to Port Charlotte, and from Port Charlotte south were the Calusa. The Calusa were an extremely warlike tribe, and they crossed over into this territory quite a bit. They were even found out on Anna Maria Island at certain times.
Is this after the Seminoles were here or during that time?
No, this I'm talking pre and historical.
Pre-Seminole.
Yeah, no, I'm talking prehistory or historical times. Now the Timmies did not use our island as a home base. They did not build their villages on this island. They were a little more sensible than we were, or we are. They preferred permanent sites in the shelters of the bays on the mainland. They used the island as a hunting ground. And they used it recreationally, same as we do. They came here for picnics, stayed here when they wanted to rest, enjoy the ocean, but they lived on the mainland. The houses they lived in were called chickees, same as the Seminole call their homes today. They were round in shape. They were had upright poles and framework. They were thatched with the roofs and the walls were thatched with palmetto. They were up above the ground. We all know we live in a swamp. And also for protection from animals, and the elevation helped a little bit. Now after I'd say in the historical period that we can read about, I guess some really accurate information, they started building mounds, and they put their houses on top of mounds. Now when I say a mound, I mean a large hill with the top cut off, and the house built on top. This also was a very good safety feature for them. Okay. Villages were fortified, surrounded by a stockade, with a guardhouse at the entrance. It's very important. Indians went to war just like everyone else did. They raided one another and took what they needed. The Timmies planted crops twice a year. They grew the typical Indian crops that we always hear about: corn, beans, squash, pumpkin, and tobacco. Always, twice a year. 2 gardens in Florida, that's good, very good. Same as we do today. They also gathered wild fruits and berries and nuts that Mother Nature provided. The meat they ate were fish. They either netted fish or speared them, collected shellfish. They ate turkey, deer, possum, and baked rattlesnake. Obviously they didn't get them all, did they? All non-perishables would be stored in a granary, and this would be divided evenly among everyone. No matter how much you grew, everything was, was shared alike. Now, when the work on the mainland was done, it was time to go hunting or harvest out in the ocean, or the Gulf, as my husband keeps reminding me. The whole family went. The men, the women, and the children. They came across the bay and dug out canoes, or they waited for low tide and walked across it. If any of you have ever been sailing out there, you know it's pretty shallow. course, at low tide, you have to wait for low tide. On this island were discovered middens. Does anyone know, have an idea what a midden is, a shell midden? When the women were gathering their shellfish, instead of carrying all of these heavy shells back to camp, they shucked everything right away. The oysters might be smoked, or they did some smoking and drying right here on the island. And consequently, these big hills of shells grew up, and they're called middens. Things you would also find in there would be discarded broken tools and pottery. The Timmies also made pottery. You might find shark teeth and bones from different fish and animals that they, were hunting for on the island. These were very important because they gave great clues to archaeologists. In fact, it's the only way we have gotten any history of the Indians down here, prehistory especially of Florida. Nothing is written about them. It's what's been found out after the fact. The things that were written were done by the missionaries, by the priests from the Spanish Catholic Church, explorers, but they were all taken back to Europe. And they're still there, buried somewhere in a basement in the church. But no one can find them. Every once in a while you might find, some information might come out. Now they had another type of mound called a ceremonial mound, and that's self-explanatory. All ceremonies were performed on the mound. They also had burial mounds. Their dead were buried in mounds. At times, if they were at war and they couldn't have a ceremony or couldn't bury right away, they might be wrapped in deer skins and placed up in trees, and they would let the flesh rot. They weren't interested in the flesh. They knew nothing of the soul. They wanted the bones. So then they would take the bones, and the bones would be placed in the burial mounds. In fact, one of the worst jobs in the tribe, if you were some sort of criminal, your job was to guard the decaying bodies and keep the animals away from them. Now what about physical appearance? Well, they were tawny colored in skin. The men were taller and much more muscular than the Europeans that came. The women were very stately, with long hair, and wore skirts woven of Spanish moss. The men wore a breechcloth made of painted deerskin. That's it. The men would bind their hair up in a bun. They had very long hair. And they would get it up as high as maybe a foot up off their head. And then they adorned it with feathers. But during war or during hunting, they used their hair as a quiver for their arrows. They stuck the arrows in the hair, and as they were using them, they just pulled them out and put them in their bow. And the one on me, I never thought of that one before. The men were heavily tattooed all over the body, but not the face, with various designs in 3 colors, black, blue, and red. Of course, these colors were all made from natural substances that they made them from. Both men and women pierced their ears many times. And they wore shell, bone, and stone jewelry. This is prehistory. After the explorers came over in first contact, the traders came with, and they brought trade goods. And then the Indians started to wear glass beads and metal beads. I'm wearing a necklace of trade goods, trade beads. And this is my only artifact from this area. They're tokens from Fort DeSoto. They were used as money. They were given to the Indians in trade, and then the Indians would spend this like money to get things they wanted, at the fort. And my nephew found them. He was out digging. He's been down here for 30-some years. Pardon? Who asked me that?
Where did they find us?
Fort DeSoto. That's where they came from. I have lots of artifacts, but nothing from Florida. I've just been here a year, so it's going to take me a while. Let's see. Their tools and weapons were fashioned from chipped stone. You know, flint, that type of thing. This is prehistory. But let's see, what they made were their arrow and spearhead and knives and scrapers, that type of thing, hammers, axes. The shells were used for bowls, cups, and hoes for gardening. But after white contact, they carved wood tools. And they also had metal available at that time. They used them for their bows and their arrows and cups and bowls and trays, mortars and pestles. Now this is the first time that they started grinding grains of any kind. It was after contact. Sharp teeth were used for spears and for arrowheads. Fish jaws were used for saws. And the sharp teeth were also used for clubs, maybe a nice big metal ball with big sharp tooth on it, very sharp. Types of that as a club. And then they also had a wooden sword that they embedded sharp teeth in. They called it a sword, but it was more like a club also. The Timmies were sun worshippers. And they had a very highly developed religion and cultural life. When the Spanish came here and brought the priests with them, they were bound and determined to convert them. They felt that if they could convert the Indian, then they could control them. And they wanted to control them so that they could get the land and then use them as a workforce. And they pretty well succeeded. They really did. Now the men traveled as far south as Cuba in their dugout canoes to trade. They had extensive trade routes all over the country, the Indians did. So if you're in your garden someday and you turn a soil over and you come up with a piece of abalone, say, well, that's from the other side of the country. It's got nothing to do with Florida. Yes, it does. It may not be new. It may be very old. And it may have gotten here through the trade routes that went across the country. They traded up to Canada, down to Florida, and from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So they were able to get things they needed in this manner. Now, of course, when the traders came, the white traders came, they brought many things with them to get things they wanted back. So this was kind of a downfall for the Indian. They did very well without these things until we got here and told them they had to have them. And then they needed them all of a sudden. So I want you to watch for things when you walk the beach, when you work in your garden, or if you're on a path that hasn't been dug. I mean, there are arrowheads running, laying around. I mean, you can find a lot of things. You just have to keep your eyes open.
I hate to be the one always asking questions, but I'm not sure. Is abalone not native to this?
No,
this
the
coast?
Pacific coast. Yeah. No, that's a little different. You're talking about the shell that looks like a pearlized shell.
No, I just, she's on jewelry.
Oh yeah, no, abalone. True abalone comes from the Pacific. It's not in the Atlantic. Now I want to just educate you a little bit about what it's going to cost you if you do pick up one of these artifacts. It is a crime to steal or destroy cultural resources on state or federal land. These sites are protected by state and federal laws. Some laws provide extreme penalties of up to $100,000 and or 5 years imprisonment. If you pick up an eagle feather and you keep it, this is your punishment.
How does one know?
Well, if I saw you, I'd tell on you.
I mean, if the person is completely innocent of these facts.
Okay. You should know these things, okay? You should know them, really. I know them because I worked in the museum. All eagle feathers in this country are counted and registered with the Department of Interior. The only people in this country that are allowed to own eagle feathers are the American Indian, because they're still used in religious rites for them, the museums. That's it.
Well, you turn them over to somebody?
Yes, yes. If you pick it up off the ground, you send it to the Department of Interior in Washington, D.C.
That's not too far from
Yeah. Zoos. My sister works at the Brookfield Zoo in Chicago. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Brookfield. It's a very big, well-known zoo. And they have a predator-prey program. And I was sitting there with an Indian friend of mine that had come to Chicago to visit when I was still living there. And we were watching this eagle flying back and forth during this program. And one of his tail feathers fell out and fluttered down and landed in her lap. Well, this was the best omen that she had ever received in her life. But she could not keep that feather, because they came right over and picked it up, and they collect all feathers that are molted or dropped from certain, endangered animals, and I mean birds, and they're sent into the Department of Interior. Now the Indians themselves will put their names on a list. They use the eagle feathers in their costumes when they dance and for their ceremonies. So their name goes on a list, and when their name comes up, and the list may be 2 or 3 years long, the government informs you that they're sending you some feathers. Well, you don't get nice, clean feathers. You get a carcass that's been in a freezer, and or maybe a skin that isn't smelling too good, at the time you receive it. So you have all of this, work of preparing, the feathers ahead of you. But that's a story on feathers, and that's just to tell you about how really strong they are about these things. Yes?
We would like to have a collection at the museum of arrowheads. Now, there's no penalty to collecting an arrowhead, ought to be.
I'm talking about endangered things that are on the endangered list, okay? Or burial or funeral items. Now here's another one. This one will get you. Native American burial sites. In Florida, it is a felony. Now that's hard. Felony to disturb a marked or unmarked grave, or to deal in objects from graves. So be very careful.
I used to stay over Free Bay when I come in, and I heard that whole little island out there had burial mounds.
Yes, there were 2 out there.
How did they get the right to build on that then?
I tell you, how did they get the land away from the Indians in the first place? They just do it.
I mean, there were burial mounds out
Yeah,
there.
right. They haven't been disturbed. They've been fenced off now.
Oh, have they?
Yes, and they haven't been dug yet. Someday the universities will get around to it, but that's the state of it now.
Then they haven't built over them.
No, not on the mountains, no. And if you're leaving our island and you're approaching Perico, that's the second bridge, you're going over the second bridge, and you look to the left and the right of the bridge, you'll notice some trees that are higher than the rest of the surrounding area. That's where the mounds are. And they're not devoid of vegetation. There are trees and bushes and things growing there now. They're still there. There were some on this island, on the island, that were dug, but nothing very much came from it. They found a few things, but Since this was not a permanent housing site, you know, it was just a hunting camp. Things were found, and middens were the biggest, you know, thing that they found. Do you have any other questions?
Ivy Island?
Pardon?
Ivy Island?
I don't know. Yes, I hear from my friend Carol that they have a small museum. In fact, I've been invited, and I can't wait to go because I really would like to see the artifacts that were found there. Someone knew their history and saved these things, and that's wonderful. And I ask all of you now, if you come across an artifact, it would be very nice for you to have, but just imagine what it would be for the society, historical society to have, and to share with everyone. So I ask you, please, donate it. Donate it to the society. And for you members of the society right now, I urge you, please, find out from the realtors on this island when a virgin lot is going to be dug. Get over there in your cars and sit there and watch. If a contractor should unearth any type of artifact, he is to stop immediately and report it. Well, they just kick them aside or dump them because it's costing them money. So you sit there and you watch. And when something like that turns up, you ask for it for your society. And that's how you can get some of these things, you know, to display in your museum. They're very hard to come by, especially on the island. Any other questions on that? Yes, sir.
Where were the mounds around there?
Around Bean Point, south a little bit of Bean Point. You can't see them now. I mean, they're pretty washed down. The only way you can really notice it is when you're walking from the road, going towards the beach. You can see a little rise in the land. That's where the big one was, the big midden.
Did you ever hear they built manatee out to the island off of those mounds? They used the dirt to build that?
No, I didn't know that. Did they
That's what I
really?
heard. They scraped them right down and made the road out there.
I'll tell you, you have a very nice museum in Bradenton, South Florida Museum. When I started doing research on the Timmies, there was nothing available. And I have been researching for many years. I've lectured on all tribes across this country. And I was at a loss. I couldn't believe it. So I thought, well, get a hold of another museum person. So I got a hold of the curator at museum in town, and she was just a delight. She gave me a wonderful bibliography, which I would be glad to share with anyone that's interested. And she took me on a tour of the museum. Luckily, her PhD thesis was on the subject I was trying to research. So she gave me her thesis to use. She's a wonderful gal. And you should really, if you have an interest, in learning about the Native Americans, utilize that museum. They have a wonderful, wonderful exhibit there. Get there quick before they have to cover up and take down their burial mound. They have one on display, and it has to come down. Because would you want your body displayed in a museum? And it's now law. It's federal law. These things have to be, covered up and taken down. In fact, any tribe that wants something removed from a museum can have it done now under the law, federal law.
I think they're going to still have part of the exhibit, but it will be presented differently so that it will not offend the Indians.
Yeah, good. That's good.
Yeah, I'm a docent at the
Oh, that's great. Well, great museum. It really is. I really enjoyed my time over there. And then I got to see Snooty too, so that was nice. If you have any questions about any other of the tribes after the meeting, I'll be glad to stay around and answer any questions you might, want to have about anything. Yes.
I have one very minor but interesting point. I'm also a docent at the South Florida Museum. And one thing that we tell, especially the school children that come through there, in connection with what you said about the Indians were fairly tall men. They were about 6 feet tall, and then they wore their hair in a top knot, stuck feathers in it. And when these little Spanish explorers came around, they were fairly short men, and Europeans were about 5 feet tall. And they looked up at these big, tall Indians with their feathers and their top knots, and they thought they were giants. And they made their reports that Florida was inhabited by a race of giants. And for many years, people thought if you came to Florida, you would find a race of giants.
I also was amazed at the strength that they had with their bow and arrows. And I know this to be true. My brother lives up in Hudson, Florida, and lightning had struck a tree, and he was cutting the tree up with the saw, and hit an embedded arrowhead that was embedded in the tree. He didn't even know it was there. Yeah, and I have it. He gave that to me. Yes.
When you were talking about the eagle feathers, there are still some eagles around Mayaco, aren't there?
Yes.
A few?
Yeah.
I've seen a bald eagle out here.
Yes, if you have the eagle feathers, you oh, the arrowhead. Oh, that I could give to the, well, I would give it to the area that it came from, and that's in Hudson. I don't know of a museum up there. Oh, an interesting thing too, they used fish bone for arrowheads. You can do them in fish teeth sometimes, well, the shark. But fish bone, can you imagine how strong the bone must be to be able to use it as a projectile point?
You have Indian ancestors in this group.
Yes, anyone have Indian ancestors? I know someone here in Cherokee. Cherokee? What? Do you? From the east.
This is I got this up at Manatee, Michigan, and it was made by the Ottawa Indians.
Okay.
They were putting on a show on the river, and the little kids were dancing. It was real fun.
It is great.
Now, my Cherokee Indians, I have 2 of them in my way back yonder line, and when they were in Georgia, and the Indians, the father was out hunting, and the Indians came in, and they killed the mother, and they killed the little baby, and they took the 2 daughters back up to Tennessee. And when she wouldn't marry, so they made a slave out of her, and the other one married, and she had 2 children. But there came a time when she up and left the place and came back to Georgia to her people. And this was Joshua Tyner.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
And he finally came up into Illinois with his family, and he was one of my ancestors. And I have a marriage license of another one that married Benjamin Chitty in Tennessee. And they came, her name was Ware, W-A-R-E. They came to Illinois, part of Illinois, and they're here in Illinois, and they ran a store, and the Chittyville School is named after them.
Well, that's nice. That's really nice. That's wonderful that you know your history so far
And
back.
this, when they had the Veil of Tears, the Trail of Tears that went through, well, it came up into Illinois, went near Cape Girardeau and out to Oklahoma. And I used to write to 2 of them. One was a curator of the Phillips Museum in
The Oil Man.
So
They
that's
have a
all I know
wonderful
about
museum
my Indians.
Yeah, the Phillips Museum is a wonderful museum. Oklahoma is loaded with lots of, really good stuff. My husband and I go to Oklahoma every year for a week to work with the Pawnee tribe. They're the ones that I specialized in mostly. it's just amazing what I've learned from them. But to show you how much of their culture is being lost, I've taught them everything they know about their religion. So it's Pawnee, Oklahoma. It's west of Tulsa, in that line.
How wonderful
Gilcrease
that you
is
knew
also.
it.
Pardon?
How wonderful that you knew it.
Yes, right. Well, I learned it, you know, through the museum. No, the Pawnee were different than most tribes. The Pawnee were semi-nomadic. They were farmers and hunters, and they lived in houses called earth lodges, or mud huts, they call them. They had framework. They were built just like ours. They had huge poles as framework. They had framework around the sides. They had insulation. That was the grasses that grew, and then they covered everything with sod. And over the sod, they smeared mud. And it was a great, they lasted generations, the houses, unless the Sioux came along and, you know, took care of them. But they were in Nebraska originally, and they were moved down to Oklahoma. Now, the fact that they were farmers, they didn't have, the government didn't have to teach them how to farm. So they issued every family land to farm. And the interesting thing about this, ladies, is, now here's where your cross-culture comes in. The Pawnee were a matrilineal society. That means everything belonged to the women. Everything was inherited through the woman, down to, you know, all daughters, okay? When the government gave land to the families, they gave it to the men. And then they told the men to farm, and the men said, well, I don't farm, I hunt, you know. And so there was, you know, a little problem there. But that's what happens. These farms were issued, and then the tribe as a whole received lands, which they still own today. A lot of the original families sold off their the land, their, you know, farms that were granted to them. Some still have them. In between all of these farms, the whites moved in, so it was never a reservation type thing. They were very Americanized, very early. They knew that in order to stay alive and exist, they would have to accept, you know, they just saw the whites moving with their wagons going west, and they just never stopped. And they just kept coming through their territories up in Nebraska, the Oregon Trail, and they just knew they had to. They had to accept this and try and get along with them. And then, of course, the other tribes hated them for it. It's very interesting when you get into the cultures. I mean, right here in this country, the same as it was in Europe, with all the warring that went on, it went on here too, among the tribes.
Do you know anything about the missionaries that came in to help the Indians?
To help which ones?
I don't know. Do you know anything about missionaries?
Well, all right, down in this area, it was the Spanish first, and it was a Catholic church. Besides the Spanish, you had the English, you had French, Dutch, and Portuguese that came into this country, and they all brought armies with them, and they all brought their missionaries, whether they were Catholic or Protestant or, you know, whatever. Across the country, it was the same thing. You had Quakers. You had just about every religious group, you know, out there who were trying to, quote, civilize the Indian.
Could you, if the Quakers Protestant, they wouldn't take, the Quakers wouldn't have taken the slaves though.
No, they didn't all do that, no. They didn't all do that, no. And then, of course, the Indians weren't angels either. Some tribes used slaves, like the Cherokee. They were used down here in Florida at times. Some of your Plains tribes did, you know, use slaves. It was usually someone they would capture from another tribe and bring in.
Tell about the Bickle Mound. Tell about it. The Bickle.
I don't know about the Bickle Mound.
You don't?
No.
From Tennessee.
Where was it at?
It's right across over on
Okay, well, see now, like I said, I'm new to Florida and I'm just learning. So you have to be patient with me. I can only read so much at a time, and so right now all I was studying
it's
was.
quite a big mound.
That's what
Near the Sunshine Sky one.
that one, yes, okay.
Tennessee.
All right. In fact, I did, I have a little thing on that, but I just passed over it. What's the curator's name? Young gal?
Laura.
Yes.
Oh, at the museum?
Yes,
Laura
yeah.
Branch?
Yes, Laura. Yeah, she gave me some information on that too. Yes.
Have you read any of the books of Florida in this area? Up the Manatee, the Singing River, Edge of Wilderness?
No, but they're on my list.
I read all three last year.
And I had one, where's that? That
And
sweet lady.
anyone that moves there should read those books.
Yeah, there's a lady here that she lent me her book, which I read. Where is she?
She's in the back. Jane, I'm here.
There you are. That thing is wonderful. It's an old book that someone had given her, and she lent it to me because she knew I was, going to do some research, and it's great. Boy, you have to get back into it. She said, "Oh, it's so dry." Well,
In both books, it says that the Timmy Indians, bones exhumed from the burial mounds were in excess of, some of them, 7 foot. Over on Sneed's Island.
they were really giant.
But the Calusas were shorter.
Yes,
5 foot, 5'2".
and fierce.
They had to, they're little.
Yes.
I thought the Seminoles ended up in the Everglades after the Seminole War.
No, well, actually,
West. And the ones that
when
were to go.
the creek, the lower creek that moved down into the Everglades to get away from the whites and the slavery and the warring and stuff, because it was getting, and the disease, it was getting to the point where they were losing in numbers, they just hid in there, and that's how the Seminole evolved from that initial group.
Yeah, I knew it was a mixture of the
Yeah.
two, but I thought.
Yeah.
It was a mixture of 5 different tribes. That's what I've read.
Well, yes, but see, then the upper creeks came down, and they fought with the lower creeks. If you know anything about history, they were bitter enemies. They hated one another. But eventually, you come around. You have to, in order, when your numbers are so decimated, to get some strength back, for your own protection, you need to get together, and that's what they did. Not only that, but there are a lot of black slaves that escaped and went to the Indians, especially the Seminole, because they would happily take them in and accept them as one of their own. This was one of the reasons why the government, the American government now, after the English, the Portuguese, and the French, and all the Dutch all left, they had pretty well controlled the coast. And the central part of the country was still very well controlled by the Indians. And then when the Americans came down, this is the part they wanted, that fertile farmland. And so their main objective was to get rid of them in the center. And they did. They took over. But the black slaves assimilated with them very easily. And they didn't, of course, they didn't like that either, because they were losing their workforce. I think that's about enough. Everybody wants to go home.
Well, this was a wonderful talk. About the Indians